Chapter 7 of The Man of Property. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Leanne Howlett. The Forsyte Saga, The Man of Property, by John Galsworthy. Part 1, Chapter 7, Old Jolyon's Peccadillo. Old Jolyon came out of Lord's cricket ground that same afternoon with the intention of going home. He had not reached Hamilton Terrace before he changed his mind, and hailing a cab, gave the driver an address in Wistaria Avenue. He had taken a resolution. June had hardly been at home at all that week. She had given him nothing of her company for a long time past, not, in fact, since she had become engaged to Bosinney. He never asked her for her company. It was not his habit to ask people for things. She had just that one idea now, Bosinney and his affairs, and she left him stranded in his great house with a parcel of servants and not a soul to speak to from morning to night. His club was closed for cleaning, his boards in recess. There was nothing, therefore, to take him into the city. June had wanted him to go away. She would not go herself, because Bosinney was in London. But where was he to go by himself? He could not go abroad alone. The sea upset his liver. He hated hotels. Roger went to a hydropathic. He was not going to begin that at his time of life. Those newfangled places were all humbug. With such formulas he clothed to himself the desolation of his spirit, the lines down his face deepening, his eyes day by day looking forth with the melancholy which sat so strangely on a face wont to be strong and serene. And so that afternoon he took his journey through St. John's Wood, in the golden light that sprinkled the round green bushes of the acacias before the little houses, in the summer sunshine that seemed holding a revel over the little gardens, and he looked about him with interest, for this was a district which no Forsyte entered without open disapproval and secret curiosity. His cab stopped in front of a small house of that peculiar buff colour which implies a long immunity from paint. It had an outer gate and rustic approach. He stepped out, his bearing extremely composed, his massive head with its drooping moustache and wings of white hair very upright under an excessively large top hat, his glance firm, a little angry. He had been driven into this. "Mrs. Jolyon Forsyte at home?" "Oh, yes, sir. What name shall I say, if you please, sir?" Old Jolyon could not help twinkling at the little maid as he gave his name. She seemed to him such a funny little toad. And he followed her through the dark hall into a small double drawing-room, where the furniture was covered in chintz, and the little maid placed him in a chair. "They're all in the garden, sir. If you'll kindly take a seat, I'll tell them." Old Jolyon sat down in the chintz-covered chair and looked around him. The whole place seemed to him, as he would have expressed it, poky. There was a certain, he could not tell exactly what, air of shabbiness, or rather of making two ends meet, about everything. As far as he could see, not a single piece of furniture was worth a £5 note. The walls, distempered rather a long time ago, were decorated with water-colour sketches. Across the ceiling meandered a long crack. These little houses were all old, second-rate concerns. He should hope the rent was under 100 a year. It hurt him more than he could have said, to think of a Forsyte, his own son, living in such a place. The little maid came back. Would he please to go down into the garden? Old Jolyon marched out through the French windows. In descending the steps he noticed that they wanted painting. Young Jolyon, his wife, his 2 children, and his dog Balthasar were all out there under a pear tree. This walk towards them was the most courageous act of old Jolyon's life, but no muscle of his face moved, no nervous gesture betrayed him. He kept his deep-set eyes steadily on the enemy. In those 2 minutes he demonstrated to perfection all that unconscious soundness, balance, and vitality of fibre that made of him and so many others of his class the core of the nation. In the unostentatious conduct of their own affairs, to the neglect of everything else, they typified the essential individualism born in the Briton from the natural isolation of his country's life. The dog Balthasar sniffed round the edges of his trousers. This friendly and cynical mongrel, offspring of a liaison between a Russian poodle and a fox terrier, had a nose for the unusual. The strange greetings over, old Jolyon seated himself in a wicker chair, and his 2 grandchildren, one on each side of his knees, looked at him silently, never having seen so old a man. They were unlike, as though recognizing the difference set between them by the circumstances of their births. Jolly, the child of sin, pudgy-faced, with his tow-coloured hair brushed off his forehead, and a dimple in his chin, had an air of stubborn amiability, and the eyes of a Forsyte. Little Holly, the child of wedlock, was a dark-skinned, solemn soul, with her mother's grey and wistful eyes. The dog Balthazar, having walked round the 3 small flower beds, to show his extreme contempt for things at large, had also taken a seat in front of Old Jolyon, and, oscillating a tail curled by nature tightly over his back, was staring up with eyes that did not blink. Even in the garden, that sense of things being poky haunted Old Jolyon. The wicker chair creaked under his weight, the garden beds looked daverdy, on the far side, under the smut-stained wall, cats had made a path. While he and his grandchildren thus regarded each other with the peculiar scrutiny, curious yet trustful, that passes between the very young and the very old, young Jolyon watched his wife. The colour had deepened in her thin oval face, with its straight brows and large grey eyes. Her hair, brushed in fine, high curves back from her forehead, was going grey, like his own, and this greyness made the sudden vivid colour in her cheeks painfully pathetic. The look on her face, such as he had never seen there before, such as she had always hidden from him, was full of secret resentments and longings and fears. Her eyes, under their twitching brows, stared painfully, and she was silent. Jolly alone sustained the conversation. He had many possessions, and was anxious that his unknown friend with extremely large moustaches and hands all covered with blue veins, who sat with legs crossed like his own father, a habit he was himself trying to acquire, should know it. But being a Forsyte, though not yet quite 8 years old, he made no mention of the thing at the moment dearest to his heart, a camp of soldiers in a shop window, which his father had promised to buy. No doubt it seemed to him too precious, a tempting of Providence, to mention it yet. And the sunlight played through the leaves on that little party of the 3 generations grouped tranquilly under the pear-tree which had long borne no fruit. Old Jolyon's furrowed face was reddening patchily, as old men's faces redden in the sun. He took one of Jolly's hands in his own. The boy climbed onto his knee, and little Holly, mesmerized by this sight, crept up to them. The sound of the dog Balthazar's scratching arose rhythmically. Suddenly young Mrs. Jolyon got up and hurried indoors. A minute later her husband muttered an excuse and followed. Old Jolyon was left alone with his grandchildren. And nature, with her quaint irony, began working in him one of her strange revolutions, following her cyclic laws into the depths of his heart, and that tenderness for little children, that passion for the beginnings of life which had once made him forsake his sun and follow June, now worked in him to forsake June and follow these littler things. Youth, like a flame, burned ever in his breast, and to youth he turned, to the round little limbs so reckless that wanted care, to the small round faces so unreasonably solemn or bright, to the treble tongues and the shrill chuckling laughter, to the insistent tugging hands and the feel of small bodies against his legs, to all that was young and once more young. And his eyes grew soft, his voice and thin veined hands soft, and soft his heart within him. And to those small creatures he became at once a place of pleasure, a place where they were secure and could talk and laugh and play, till like sunshine there radiated from old Jolyon's wicker chair the perfect gaiety of 3 hearts. But with young Jolyon following to his wife's room it was different. He found her seated on a chair before her dressing-glass, with her hands before her face. Her shoulders were shaking with sobs. This passion of hers for suffering was mysterious to him. He had been through 100 of these moods. How he had survived them he never knew, for he could never believe they were moods, and that the last hour of his partnership had not struck. In the night she would be sure to throw her arms round his neck and say, "Oh, Joe, how I make you suffer," as she had done 100 times before. He reached out his hand and, unseen, slipped his razor-case into his pocket. "I cannot stay here," he thought. "I must go down." Without a word he left the room and went back to the lawn. Old Jolyon had little Holly on his knee. She had taken possession of his watch. Jolly, very red in the face, was trying to show that he could stand on his head. The dog Balthazar, as close as he might be to the tea-table, has fixed his eyes on the cake. Young Jolyon felt a malicious desire to cut their enjoyment short. What business had his father to come and upset his wife like this? It was a shock after all these years. He ought to have known. He ought to have given them warning. But when did a Forsyte ever imagine that his conduct could upset anybody? And in his thoughts he did old Jolyon wrong. He spoke sharply to the children and told them to go in to their tea. Greatly surprised, for they had never heard their father speak sharply before, they went off, hand in hand, little Holly looking back over her shoulder. Young Jolyon poured out the tea. "My wife's not the thing to-day," he said, but he knew well enough that his father had penetrated the cause of that sudden withdrawal, and almost hated the old man for sitting there so calmly. "You've got a nice little house here," said old Jolyon with a shrewd look. "I suppose you've taken a lease of it?" Young Jolyon nodded. "I don't like the neighbourhood," said old Jolyon. "A ramshackle lot." Young Jolyon replied, "Yes, we're a ramshackle lot." The silence was now only broken by the sound of the dog Balthazar's scratching. Old Jolyon said simply, "I suppose I oughtn't to have come here, Joe, but I get so lonely." At these words young Jolyon got up and put his hand on his father's shoulder. In the next house someone was playing over and over again "La Donna Mobile" on an untuned piano, and the little garden had fallen into shade. The sun now only reached the wall at the end, whereon basked a crouching cat, her yellow eyes turned sleepily down on the dog Balthazar. There was a drowsy hum of very distant traffic. The creepered trellis round the garden shut out everything but sky and house and pear tree, with its top branches still gilded by the sun. For some time they sat there, talking but little. Then old Jolyon rose to go, and not a word was said about his coming again. He walked away very sadly. What a poor, miserable place, and he thought of the great empty house in Stanhope Gate, fit residence for a Forsyte, with its huge billiard room and drawing room that no one entered from one week's end to another. That woman, whose face he had rather liked, was too thin-skinned by half, she gave Joe a bad time he knew, and those sweet children, ah, what a piece of awful folly! He walked towards the Edgware Road, between rows of little houses, all suggesting to him, erroneously no doubt, with the prejudices of a Forsyte or sacred, shady histories of some sort or kind. Society, forsooth, the chattering hags and jackanapes, had set themselves up to pass judgment on his flesh and blood. A parcel of old women. He stumped his umbrella on the ground, as though to drive it into the heart of that unfortunate body, which had dared to ostracize his son and his son's son, and whom he could have lived again. He stumped his umbrella fiercely, yet he himself had followed society's behaviour for 15 years, had only to-day been false to it. He thought of June and her dead mother, and the whole story, with all his old bitterness. A wretched business. He was a long time reaching Stanhope Gate, for with native perversity, being extremely tired, he walked the whole way. After washing his hands in the lavatory downstairs, he went to the dining room to wait for dinner, the only room he used when June was out. It was less lonely so. The evening paper had not yet come. He had finished the Times. There was therefore nothing to do. The room faced the backwater of traffic, and was very silent. He disliked dogs, but a dog even would have been company. His gaze, travelling around the walls, rested on a picture entitled "Group of Dutch Fishing Boats at Sunset," the chef d'oeuvre of his collection. It gave him no pleasure. He closed his eyes. He was lonely. He oughtn't to complain, he knew, but he couldn't help it. He was a poor thing, had always been a poor thing, no pluck. Such was his thought. The butler came to lay the table for dinner, and seeing his master apparently asleep, exercised extreme caution in his movements. This bearded man also wore a moustache, which had given rise to grave doubts in the minds of many members of the family, especially those who, like Soames, had been to public schools and were accustomed to niceness in such matters. Could he really be considered a butler? Playful spirits alluded to him as Uncle Jolyon's nonconformist. George, the acknowledged wag, had named him Sankey. He moved to and fro between the great polished sideboard and the great polished table, inimitably sleek and soft. Old Jolyon watched him, feigning sleep. The fellow was a sneak, he had always thought so, who cared about nothing but rattling through his work, and getting out to his bedding, or his woman, or goodness knew what. A slug, fat too, and didn't care a pin about his master. But then, against his will, came one of those moments of philosophy which made old Jolyon different from other Forsytes. After all, why should the man care? He wasn't paid to care, and why expect it? In this world people couldn't look for affection unless they paid for it. It might be different in the next, he didn't know, couldn't tell, and again he shut his eyes. Relentless and stealthy, the butler pursued his labours, taking things from the various compartments on the sideboard. His back seemed always turned to old Jolyon, thus he robbed his operations of the unseemliness of being carried on in his master's presence. Now and then he furtively breathed on the silver, and wiped it with a piece of chamois leather. He appeared to pore over the quantities of wine in the decanters, which he carried carefully and rather high, letting his head droop over them protectingly. When he had finished, he stood for over a minute watching his master, and in his greenish eyes there was a look of contempt. After all, this master of his was an old buffer, who hadn't much left in him. Soft as a tomcat, he crossed the room to press the bell. His orders were dinner at 7. What if his master were asleep? He would soon have him out of that. There was the night to sleep in. He had himself to think of, for he was due at his club at 8:30. In answer to the ring appeared a page boy with a silver soup tureen. The butler took it from his hands and placed it on the table. Then, standing by the open door, as though about to usher company into the room, he said in a solemn voice, "Dinner is on the table, sir." Slowly old Jolyon got up out of his chair and sat down at the table to eat his dinner. End of Part 1, Chapter 7. Recording by Leanne Howlett. Chapter 8 of The Man of Property. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Leanne Howlett. The Forsyte Saga, The Man of Property, by John Galsworthy. Part 1, Chapter 8, Plans of the House. Forsytes, as is generally admitted, have shells, like that extremely useful little animal which is made into Turkish delight. In other words, they are never seen, or if seen would not be recognized, without habitats composed of circumstance, property, acquaintances, and wives, which seem to move along with them in their passage through a world composed of thousands of other Forsytes with their habitats. Without a habitat, a Forsyte is inconceivable. He would be like a novel without a plot, which is well known to be an anomaly. To Forsyte eyes, Bosinney appeared to have no habitat. He seemed one of those rare and unfortunate men who go through life surrounded by circumstance, property, acquaintances, and wives that do not belong to them. His rooms in Sloane Street, on the top floor, outside which on a plate was his name, Philip Bosinney, architect, were not those of a Forsyte. He had no sitting room apart from his office, but a large recess had been screened off to conceal the necessaries of life: a couch, an easy chair, his pipes, spirit case, novels, and slippers. The business part of the room had the usual furniture: an open cupboard with pigeonholes, a round oak table, a folding washstand, some hard chairs, a standing desk of large dimensions covered with drawings and designs. June had twice been to tea there under the chaperonage of his aunt. He was believed to have a bedroom at the back. As far as the family had been able to ascertain his income, it consisted of 2 consulting appointments at £20 a year, together with an odd fee once in a way, and, more worthy item, a private annuity under his father's will of £150 a year. What had transpired concerning that father was not so reassuring. It appeared that he had been a Lincolnshire country doctor of Cornish extraction, striking appearance and Byronic tendencies, a well-known figure, in fact, in his county. Bosinney's uncle by marriage, Baynes, of Baynes and Bilderboy, a Forsyte in instincts if not in name, had but little that was worthy to relate of his brother-in-law. An odd fellow, he would say, always spoke of his 3 eldest boys as "good creatures, but so dull they're all doing capitally in the Indian Civil." Philip was the only one he liked. I've heard him talk in the queerest way. He once said to me, "My dear fellow, never let your poor wife know what you're thinking of." But I didn't follow his advice, not I, an eccentric man. He would say to Phil, "Whether you live like a gentleman or not, my boy, be sure you die like one." And he had himself embalmed in a frock-coat suit, with a satin cravat and a diamond pin. Oh, quite an original, I can assure you. Of Bosinney himself, Baynes would speak warmly, with a certain compassion. "He's got a streak of his father's Byronism. Why, look at the way he threw up his chances when he left my office, going off like that for 6 months with a knapsack, and all for what? To study foreign architecture. Foreign! What could he expect? And there he is, a clever young fellow, doesn't make his 100 a year. Now this engagement is the best thing that could have happened. Keep him steady. He's one of those that go to bed all day and stay up all night, simply because they've no method. But no vice about him, not an ounce of vice. Oh, Forsyte's a rich man." Mr. Baynes made himself extremely pleasant to June, who frequently visited his house in Lowndes Square at this period. "This house of your cousin's, what a capital man of business, is the very thing for Philip," he would say to her. "You mustn't expect to see too much of him just now, my dear young lady. The good cause, the good cause. The young man must make his way. When I was his age I was at work day and night. My dear wife used to say to me, 'Bobby, don't work too hard, think of your health,' but I never spared myself." June had complained that her lover found no time to come to Stanhope Gate. The first time he came again they had not been together a quarter of an hour before, by one of those coincidences of which she was a mistress, Mrs. Septimus Small arrived. Thereon Bosinney rose and hid himself, according to previous arrangement, in the little study to wait for her departure. "My dear," said Aunt Juley, "how thin he is! I've often noticed it with engaged people, but you mustn't let it get worse. There's Barlow's extract of veal; it did your Uncle Swithin a lot of good." June, her little figure erect before the hearth, her small face quivering grimly, for she regarded her aunt's untimely visit in the light of a personal injury, replied with scorn: "It's because he's busy. People who can do anything worth doing are never fat." Aunt Juley pouted. She herself had always been thin, but the only pleasure she derived from the fact was the opportunity of longing to be stouter. "I don't think," she said mournfully, "that you ought to let them call him the Buccaneer. People might think it odd, now that he's going to build a house for Soames. I do hope he will be careful. It's so important for him. Soames has such good taste." "Taste!" cried June, flaring up at once. "Wouldn't give that for his taste, or any of the family's." Mrs. Small was taken aback. "Your Uncle Swithin," she said, "always had beautiful taste, and Soames's little house is lovely. You don't mean to say you don't think so?" "Humph!" said June. "That's only because Irene's there." Aunt Juley tried to say something pleasant. "And how will dear Irene like living in the country?" June gazed at her intently, with a look in her eyes as if her conscience had suddenly leaped up into them. It passed, and an even more intent look took its place, as if she had stared that conscience out of countenance. She replied imperiously: "Of course she'll like it. Why shouldn't she?" Mrs. Small grew nervous. "I didn't know," she said. "I thought she mightn't like to leave her friends. Your Uncle James says she doesn't take enough interest in life. We think, Timothy thinks, she ought to go out more. I expect you'll miss her very much." June clasped her hands behind her neck. "I do wish," she cried, "Uncle Timothy wouldn't talk about what doesn't concern him." Aunt Juley rose to the full height of her tall figure. "He never talks about what doesn't concern him," she said. June was instantly compunctious. She ran to her aunt and kissed her. "I'm very sorry, Auntie, but I wish they'd let Irene alone." Aunt Juley, unable to think of anything further on the subject that would be suitable, was silent. She prepared for departure, hooking her black silk cape across her chest, and taking up her green reticule. "And how is your dear grandfather?" she asked in the hall. "I expect he's very lonely now that all your time is taken up with Mr. Bosinney." She bent and kissed her niece hungrily, and with little, mincing steps passed away. The tears sprang up in June's eyes. Running into the little study, where Bosinney was sitting at the table drawing birds on the back of an envelope, she sank down by his side and cried: "Oh, Phil, it's all so horrid!" Her heart was as warm as the colour of her hair. On the following Sunday morning, while Soames was shaving, a message was brought him to the effect that Mr. Bosinney was below, and would be glad to see him. Opening the door into his wife's room, he said: "Bosinney's downstairs. Just go and entertain him while I finish shaving. I'll be down in a minute. It's about the plans, I expect." Irene looked at him without reply, put the finishing touch to her dress, and went downstairs. He could not make her out about this house. She had said nothing against it, and as far as Bosinney was concerned, seemed friendly enough. From the window of his dressing room he could see them talking together in the little court below. He hurried on with his shaving, cutting his chin twice. He heard them laugh, and thought to himself, "Well, they get on all right, anyway." As he expected, Bosinney had come round to fetch him to look at the plans. He took his hat and went over. The plans were spread on the oak table in the architect's room, and pale, imperturbable, inquiring Soames bent over them for a long time without speaking. He said at last in a puzzled voice: "It's an odd sort of house." A rectangular house of 2 stories was designed in a quadrangle round a covered-in court. This court, encircled by a gallery on the upper floor, was roofed with a glass roof, supported by 8 columns running up from the ground. It was indeed, to Forsyte eyes, an odd house. "There's a lot of room cut to waste," pursued Soames. Bosinney began to walk about, and Soames did not like the expression on his face. "The principle of this house," said the architect, "was that you should have room to breathe, like a gentleman." Soames extended his finger and thumb, as if measuring the extent of the distinction he should acquire, and replied: "Oh, yes, I see." The peculiar look came into Bosinney's face which marked all his enthusiasms. "I've tried to plan you a house here with some self-respect of its own. If you don't like it, you'd better say so. It's certainly the last thing to be considered. Who wants self-respect in a house when you can squeeze in an extra lavatory?" He put his finger suddenly down on the left division of the centre oblong. "You can swing a cat here. This is for your pictures. Divided from this court by curtains, draw them back, and you'll have a space of 51 by 23 6. This double-faced stove in the centre here looks one way towards the court, one way towards the picture-room. This end wall is all window. You've a south-east light from that, a north light from the court. The rest of your pictures you can hang round the gallery upstairs or in the other rooms. In architecture," he went on, and though looking at Soames he did not seem to see him, which gave Soames an unpleasant feeling, "as in life, you'll get no self-respect without regularity. Fellows tell you that's old-fashioned. It appears to be peculiar anyway. It never occurs to us to embody the main principle of life in our buildings. We load our houses with decoration, gimcracks, corners, anything to distract the eye. On the contrary, the eye should rest. Get your effects with a few strong lines. The whole thing is regularity. There's no self-respect without it." Soames, the unconscious ironist, fixed his gaze on Bosinney's tie, which was far from being in the perpendicular. He was unshaven, too, and his dress not remarkable for order. Architecture appeared to have exhausted his regularity. "Won't it look like a barrack?" he inquired. He did not at once receive a reply. "I can see what it is," said Bosinney. "You want one of Littlemaster's houses, one of the pretty and commodious sort, where the servants will live in garrets, and the front door be sunk so that you may come up again. By all means try Littlemaster. You'll find him a capital fellow. I've known him all my life." Soames was alarmed. He had really been struck by the plans, and the concealment of his satisfaction had been merely instinctive. It was difficult for him to pay a compliment. He despised people who were lavish with their praises. He found himself now in the embarrassing position of one who must pay a compliment or run the risk of losing a good thing. Bosinney was just the fellow who might tear up the plans and refuse to act for him, a kind of grown-up child. This grown-up childishness, to which he felt so superior, exercised a peculiar and almost mesmeric effect on Soames, for he had never felt anything like it in himself. "Well," he stammered at last, it's certainly original." He had such a private distrust and even dislike of the word original that he felt he had not really given himself away by this remark. Bosinney seemed pleased. It was the sort of thing that would please a fellow like that, and his success encouraged Soames. "It's a big place," he said. "Space, air, light," he heard Bosinney murmur. "You can't live like a gentleman in one of Littlemaster's. He builds for manufacturers." Soames made a deprecating movement. He had been identified with the gentleman. Not for a good deal of money now would he be classed with manufacturers. But his innate distrust of general principles revived. What the deuce was the good of talking about regularity and self-respect? It looked to him as if the house would be cold. "Irene can't stand the cold," he said. "Ah," said Bosinney sarcastically. "Your wife? She doesn't like the cold? I'll see to that. She shan't be cold. Look here." He pointed to 4 marks at regular intervals on the walls of the court. "I've given you hot water pipes and aluminum casings. You can get them with very good designs." Soames looked suspiciously at these marks. "It's all very well, all this," he said, "but what's it going to cost?" The architect took a sheet of paper from his pocket. "The house, of course, should be built entirely of stone, but as I thought you wouldn't stand that, I've compromised for a facing. It ought to have a copper roof, but I've made it green slate. As it is, including metal work, it'll cost you $8,500. "8,500!" said Soames. "Why, I gave you an outside limit of 8. "Can't be done for a penny less," replied Bosinney coolly. "You must take it or leave it." It was the only way, probably, that such a proposition could have been made to Soames. He was nonplussed. Conscience told him to throw the whole thing up, but the design was good, and he knew it. There was completeness about it, and dignity. The servants' apartments were excellent too. He would gain credit by living in a house like that, with such individual features, yet perfectly well arranged. He continued poring over the plans while Bosinney went into his bedroom to shave and dress. The two walked back to Montpellier Square in silence, Soames watching him out of the corner of his eye. The Buccaneer was rather a good-looking fellow, so he thought, when he was properly got up. Irene was bending over her flowers when the 2 men came in. She spoke of sending across the park to fetch June. "No, no," said Soames, "we've still got business to talk over." At lunch he was almost cordial, and kept pressing Bosinney to eat. He was pleased to see the architect in such high spirits, and left him to spend the afternoon with Irene, while he stole off to his pictures, after his Sunday habit. At tea time he came down to the drawing-room, and found them talking, as he expressed it, 19 to the dozen. Unobserved in the doorway, he congratulated himself that things were taking the right turn. It was lucky she and Bosinney got on. She seemed to be falling into line with the idea of the new house. Quiet meditation among his pictures had decided him to spring the 500 if necessary. But he hoped that the afternoon might have softened Bosinney's estimates. It was so purely a matter which Bosinney could remedy if he liked. There must be a dozen ways in which he could cheapen the production of a house without spoiling the effect. He awaited, therefore, his opportunity till Irene was handing the architect his first cup of tea. A chink of sunshine through the lace of the blinds warmed her cheek, shone in the gold of her hair, and in her soft eyes. Possibly the same gleam deepened Bosinney's colour, gave the rather startled look to his face. Soames hated sunshine, and he at once got up to draw the blind. Then he took his own cup of tea from his wife, and said, more coldly than he had intended, "Can't you see your way to do it for 8,000 after all? There must be a lot of little things you could alter." Bosinney drank off his tea at a gulp, put down his cup, and answered, "Not one." Soames saw that his suggestion had touched some unintelligible point of personal vanity. "Well," he agreed with sulky resignation, "you must have it your own way, I suppose." A few minutes later Bosinney rose to go, and Soames rose too, to see him off the premises. The architect seemed in absurdly high spirits. After watching him walk away at a swinging pace, Soames returned moodily to the drawing-room, where Irene was putting away the music, and, moved by an uncontrollable spasm of curiosity, he asked, "Well, what do you think of the Buccaneer?" He looked at the carpet while waiting for her answer, and he had to wait some time. "I don't know," she said at last. "Do you think he's good-looking?" Irene smiled, and it seemed to Soames that she was mocking him. "Yes," she answered, "very." End of Part 1, Chapter 8. Recording by Leanne Howlett.
Chapter 9 of The Man of Property. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Janet West. The Forsyte Saga, The Man of Property, by John Galsworthy. Part 1, Chapter 9, The Death of Aunt Anne. There came a morning at the end of September when Aunt Anne was unable to take from Smither's hands the insignia of personal dignity. After one look at the old face, the doctor, hurriedly sent for, announced that Miss Forsyte had passed away in her sleep. Aunts Julie and Hester were overwhelmed by the shock. They had never imagined such an ending. Indeed, it is doubtful whether they had ever realized that an ending was bound to come. Secretly, they felt it unreasonable of Anne to have left them like this, without a word, without even a struggle. It was unlike her. Perhaps what really affected them so profoundly was the thought that a Forsyte should have let go her grasp on life. If one, then why not all? It was a full hour before they could make up their minds to tell Timothy. If only it could be kept from him. If only it could be broken to him by degrees. And long they stood outside his door whispering together. And when it was over, they whispered together again. He would feel it more, they were afraid, as time went on. Still, he had taken it better than could have been expected. He would keep his bed, of course. They separated, crying quietly. Aunt Julie stayed in her room, prostrated by the blow. Her face, discoloured by tears, was divided into compartments by the little ridges of pouting flesh which had swollen with emotion. It was impossible to conceive of life without Anne, who had lived with her for 73 years, broken only by the short interregnum of her married life, which now seemed so unreal. At fixed intervals she went to her drawer and took from beneath the lavender bags a fresh pocket handkerchief. Her warm heart could not bear the thought that Anne was lying there so cold. Aunt Hester, the silent, the patient, that backwater of the family energy, sat in the drawing-room where the blinds were drawn. And she, too, had wept at first, but quietly, without visible effect. Her guiding principle, the conservation of energy, did not abandon her in sorrow. She sat, slim, motionless, studying the grate, her hands idle in the lap of her black silk dress. They would want to rouse her into doing something, no doubt. As if there were any good in that. Doing something would not bring back Anne. Why worry her? 5 o'clock brought 3 of the brothers, Jolyon and James and Swithin. Nicholas was at Yarmouth, and Roger had a bad attack of gout. Mrs. Hayman had been there by herself earlier in the day, and, after seeing Anne, had gone away, leaving a message for Timothy, which was kept from him, that she ought to have been told sooner. In fact, there was a feeling amongst them all that they ought to have been told sooner, as though they had missed something. And James said, "I knew how it'd be. I told you she wouldn't last through the summer." Aunt Hester made no reply. It was nearly October, but what was the good of arguing? Some people were never satisfied. She sent up to tell her sister that the brothers were there. Mrs. Small came down at once. She had bathed her face, which was still swollen, and though she looked severely at Swithin's trousers, for they were of light blue, he had come straight from the club, where the news had reached him, she wore a more cheerful expression than usual, the instinct for doing the wrong thing being even now too strong for her. Presently all 5 went up to look at the body. Under the pure white sheet a quilted counterpane had been placed, for now, more than ever, Aunt Anne had need of warmth. And, the pillows removed, her spine and head rested flat, with the semblance of their lifelong inflexibility. The coif banding the top of her brow was drawn on either side to the level of the ears, and between it and the sheet, her face, almost as white, was turned with closed eyes to the faces of her brothers and sisters. In its extraordinary peace the face was stronger than ever, nearly all bone now under the scarce wrinkled parchment of her skin, square jaw and chin, cheekbones, forehead with hollow temples, chiselled nose, the fortress of an unconquerable spirit that had yielded to death, and in its upward sightlessness seemed trying to regain that spirit, to regain the guardianship it had just laid down. Swithin took but one look at the face, and left the room. The sight, he said afterwards, made him very queer. He went downstairs, shaking the whole house, and, seizing his hat, clambered into his brougham, without giving any direction to the coachman. He was driven home, and all the evening sat in his chair without moving. He could take nothing for dinner but a partridge, with an imperial pint of champagne. Old Jolyon stood at the bottom of the bed, his hands folded in front of him. He alone of those in this room remembered the death of his mother, and though he looked at Anne, it was of that he was thinking. Anne was an old woman, but death had come to her at last. Death came to all. His face did not move, his gaze seemed travelling from very far. Aunt Hester stood beside him. She did not cry now. Tears were exhausted. Her nature refused to permit a further escape of force. She twisted her hands, looking not at Anne, but from side to side, seeking some way of escaping the effort of realization. Of all the brothers and sisters, James manifested the most emotion. Tears rolled down the parallel furrows of his thin face. Where he should now go to tell his troubles he did not know. Julie was no good. Hester was worse than useless. He felt Anne's death more than he had ever thought he should. This would upset him for weeks. Presently Aunt Hester stole out, and Aunt Julie began moving about, doing what was necessary, so that twice she knocked against something. Old Jolyon, roused from his reverie, that reverie of the long, long past, looked sternly at her, and went away. James alone was left by the bedside. Glancing stealthily round, to see that he was not observed, he twisted his long body down, placed a kiss on the dead forehead, then he, too, hastily left the room. Encountering Smither in the hall, he began to ask her about the funeral, and finding she knew nothing, complained bitterly that, if they didn't take care, everything would go wrong. She had better send for Mr. Soames, he knew about that sort of thing. Her master was very much upset, he supposed. He would want looking after. As for her mistresses, they were no good. They had no gumption. They would be ill, too, he shouldn't wonder. She'd better send for the doctor, It was best to take things in time. He didn't think his sister Anne had had the best opinion. If she'd had blank, she would have been alive now. Smither might send to Park Lane any time she wanted advice. Of course, his carriage was at their service for the funeral. He supposed she hadn't such a thing as a glass of claret and a biscuit. He had had no lunch. The days before the funeral passed quietly. It had long been known, of course, that Aunt Anne had left her little property to Timothy. There was, therefore, no reason for the slightest agitation. Soames, who was sole executor, took charge of all arrangements, and in due course sent out the following invitation to every male member of the family. To Your presence is requested at the funeral of Miss Anne Forsyte, in Highgate Cemetery, at noon of October 1st. Carriages will meet at the Bower, Bayswater Road, at 10:45. No flowers by request. RSVP. The morning came, cold, with a high grey London sky, and at 10:30 the first carriage, that of James, drove up. It contained James and his son-in-law Darty, a fine man with a square chest, buttoned very tightly into a frock coat, and a sallow, fattish face adorned with dark, well-curled moustaches, and that incorrigible commencement of whisker which, eluding the strictest attempts at shaving, seems the mark of something deeply ingrained in the personality of the shaver, being especially noticeable in men who speculate. Soames, in his capacity as executor, received the guests, for Timothy still kept his bed. He would get up after the funeral. And Aunts Julie and Hester would not be coming down until it was all over, when it was understood there would be lunch for anyone who cared to come back. The next to arrive was Roger, still limping from the gout, and encircled by 3 of his sons, young Roger, Eustace, and Thomas. George, the remaining son, arrived almost immediately afterwards in a hansom, and paused in the hall to ask Soames how he found undertaking pay. They disliked each other. Then came 2 Haymans, Giles and Jessie, perfectly silent and very well dressed, with special creases down their evening trousers. Then Old Jolyon alone. Next, Nicholas, with a healthy colour in his face, and a carefully veiled sprightliness in every movement of his head and body. One of his sons followed him, meek and subdued. Swithin Forsyte and Bosinney arrived at the same moment, and stood, bowing precedence to each other, but on the door opening they tried to enter together. They renewed their apologies in the hall, and Swithin, setting his stock, which had become disarranged in the struggle, very slowly mounted the stairs. The other Hayman, 2 married sons of Nicholas, together with Tweedyman, Spender, and Wary, the husbands of married Forsyte and Hayman daughters. The company was then complete, 21 in all, not a male member of the family being absent, but Timothy and young Jolyon. Entering the scarlet and green drawing-room, whose apparel made so vivid a setting for their unaccustomed costumes, each tried nervously to find a seat, desirous of hiding the emphatic blackness of his trousers. There seemed a sort of indecency in that blackness, and in the colour of their gloves, a sort of exaggeration of the feelings, and many cast shocked looks of secret envy at the buccaneer, who had no gloves, and was wearing grey trousers. A subdued hum of conversation rose, no one speaking of the departed, but each asking after the other, as though thereby casting an indirect libation to this event, which they had come to honour. And presently James said, "Well, I think we ought to be starting." They went downstairs and, 2 and 2, as they had been told off in strict precedence, mounted the carriages. The hearse started at a foot's pace. The carriages moved slowly after. In the first went Old Jolyon with Nicholas. In the second, the twins, Swithin and James. In the third, Roger and young Roger. Soames, young Nicholas, George, and Bosinney followed in the fourth. Each of the other carriages, 8 in all, held 3 or 4 of the family. Behind them came the doctor's brougham. Then, at a decent interval, cabs containing family clerks and servants, and at the very end one containing nobody at all, but bringing the total cortege up to the number of 13. So long as the procession kept to the highway of the Bayswater Road, it retained the foot's pace, but, turning into less important thoroughfares, it soon broke into a trot, and so proceeded, with intervals of walking in the more fashionable streets, until it arrived. In the first carriage Old Jolyon and Nicholas were talking of their wills. In the second the twins, after a single attempt, had lapsed into complete silence. Both were rather deaf, and the exertion of making themselves heard was too great. Only once James broke this silence. "I shall have to be looking about for some ground somewhere. What arrangements have you made, Swithin?" And Swithin, fixing him with a dreadful stare, answered, "Don't talk to me about such things." In the third carriage a disjointed conversation was carried on in the intervals of looking out to see how far they had got, George remarking, well, it was really time that the poor old lady went. He didn't believe in people living beyond 70. Young Nicholas replied mildly that the rule didn't seem to apply to the Forsytes. George said he himself intended to commit suicide at 60. Young Nicholas, smiling and stroking a long chin, didn't think his father would like that theory. He had made a lot of money since he was 60. Well, 70 was the outside limit. It was then time, George said, for them to go and leave their money to their children. Soames, hitherto silent, here joined in. He had not forgotten the remark about the undertaking, and lifting his eyelids almost imperceptibly, said it was all very well for people who had never made money to talk. He himself intended to live as long as he could. This was a hit at George, who was notoriously hard up. Bosinney muttered abstractly, "Hear, hear!" and George, yawning, the conversation dropped. Upon arriving, the coffin was borne into the chapel, and, 2 by 2, the mourners filed in behind it. This guard of men, all attached to the dead by the bond of kinship, was an impressive and singular sight in the great city of London, with its overwhelming diversity of life, its innumerable vocations, pleasures, duties, its terrible hardness, its terrible call to individualism. The family had gathered to triumph over all this, to give a show of tenacious unity, to illustrate gloriously that law of property underlying the growth of their tree, by which it had thriven and spread, trunk and branches, the sap flowing through all, the full growth reached at the appointed time. The spirit of the old woman lying in her last sleep had called them to this demonstration. It was her final appeal to that unity which had been their strength. It was her final triumph that she had died while the tree was yet whole. She was spared the watching of the branches jut out beyond the point of balance. She could not look into the hearts of her followers. The same law that had worked in her, bringing her up from a tall, straight-backed slip of a girl to a woman strong and grown, from a woman grown to a woman old, angular, feeble, almost witch-like, with individuality all sharpened and sharpened, as all rounding from the world's contact fell off from her. That same law would work, was working, in the family she had watched like a mother. She had seen it young and growing, she had seen it strong and grown, and before her old eyes had time or strength to see any more, she died. She would have tried, and who knows but she might have kept it young and strong, with her old fingers, her trembling kisses, a little longer. Alas, not even Aunt Anne could fight with nature. Pride comes before a fall. In accordance with this, the greatest of nature's ironies, the Forsyte family had gathered for a last proud pageant before they fell. Their faces to right and left, in single lines, were turned for the most part impassively towards the ground, guardians of their thoughts. But here and there, one looking upward, with a line between his brows, searched to see some sight on the chapel walls too much for him, to be listening to something that appalled. and the responses, low muttered in voices through which rose the same tone, the same unseizable family ring, sounded weird, as though murmured in hurried duplication by a single person. The service in the chapel over, the mourners filed up again to guard the body to the tomb. The vault stood open, and, round it, men in black were waiting. From that high and sacred field, where thousands of the upper middle class lay in their last sleep, the eyes of the Forsytes travelled down across the flocks of graves. There, spreading to the distance, lay London, with no sun over it, mourning the loss of its daughter, mourning with this family so dear the loss of her who was mother and guardian. 100,000 spires and houses, blurred in the great grey web of property, lay there like prostrate worshippers before the grave of this, the oldest Forsyte of them all. A few words, a sprinkle of earth, the thrusting of the coffin home, and Aunt Anne had passed to her last rest. Round the vault, trustees of that passing, the 5 brothers stood, with white heads bowed. They would see that Anne was comfortable where she was going. Her little property must stay behind, but otherwise all that could be should be done. Then severally each stood aside, and putting on his hat, turned back to inspect the new inscription on the marble of the family vault. Sacred to the memory of Anne Forsyte, the daughter of the above Jolyon and Anne Forsyte, who departed this life the 27th day of September, 1886, aged 87 years and 4 days. Soon, perhaps, someone else would be wanting an inscription. It was strange and intolerable, for they had not thought somehow that Forsytes could die. And one and all, they had a longing to get away from this painfulness, this ceremony which had reminded them of things they could not bear to think about, to get away quickly and to go about their business and forget. It was cold, too. The wind, like some slow disintegrating force, blowing up the hill over the graves, struck them with its chilly breath. They began to split into groups, and as quickly as possible to fill the waiting carriages. Swithin said he should go back to lunch at Timothy's, and he offered to take anybody with him in his brougham. It was considered a doubtful privilege to drive with Swithin in his brougham, which was not a large one. Nobody accepted, and he went off alone. James and Roger followed immediately after. They would also drop in to lunch. The others gradually melted away, Old Jolyon taking 3 nephews to fill up his carriage. He had a want of those young faces. Soames, who had to arrange some details in the cemetery office, walked away with Bosinney. He had much to talk over with him, and, having finished his business, they strolled to Hampstead, lunched together at the Spaniards Inn, and spent a long time in going into practical details connected with the building of the house. They then proceeded to the tram line, and came as far as the Marble Arch, where Bosinney went off to Stanhope Gate to see June. Soames felt in excellent spirits when he arrived home, and confided to Irene at dinner that he'd had a good talk with Bosinney, who really seemed a sensible fellow. They had had a capital walk, too, which had done his liver good. He had been short of exercise for a long time, and altogether a very satisfactory day. If only it hadn't been for poor Aunt Anne, he would have taken her to the theatre. As it was, they must make the best of an evening at home. "The Buccaneer asked after you more than once," he said suddenly. And moved by some inexplicable desire to assert his proprietorship, he rose from his chair and planted a kiss on his wife's shoulder. End of Part 1, Chapter 9. Recording by Janet West.
Part 2, Chapter 1 of The Man of Property. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Leanne Howlett. The Forsyte Saga, The Man of Property, by John Galsworthy. Part Number 2, Chapter 1, Progress of the House. The winter had been an open one. Things in the trade were slack, and as Soames had reflected before making up his mind, it had been a good time for building. The shell of the house at Robin Hill was thus completed by the end of April. Now that there was something to be seen for his money, he had been coming down once, twice, even 3 times a week, and would mouse about among the debris for hours, careful never to soil his clothes, moving silently through the unfinished brickwork of doorways, or circling round the columns in the central court. And he would stand before them for minutes together, as though peering into the real quality of their substance. On April 30th he had an appointment with Bosinney to go over the accounts, and 5 minutes before the proper time he entered the tent which the architect had pitched for himself close to the old oak tree. The accounts were already prepared on a folding table, and with a nod Soames sat down to study them. It was some time before he raised his head. "I can't make them out," he said at last. "They come to nearly 700 more than they ought." After a glance at Bosinney's face, he went on quickly: "If you only make a firm stand against these builder chaps, you'll get them down. They stick you with everything if you don't look sharp. Take 10% off all round. I shan't mind its coming out 100 or so over the mark." Bosinney shook his head. "I've taken off every farthing I can." Soames pushed back the table with a movement of anger, which sent the account sheets fluttering to the ground. "Then all I can say is," he flustered out, "you've made a pretty mess of it." "I've told you a dozen times," Bosinney answered sharply, "that there'd be extras. I've pointed them out to you over and over again." "I know that," growled Soames. "I shouldn't have objected to a £10 note here and there. How was I to know that by 'extras' you meant £700? The qualities of both men had contributed to this not inconsiderable discrepancy. On the one hand, the architect's devotion to his idea, to the image of a house which he had created and believed in, had made him nervous of being stopped, or forced to the use of makeshifts. On the other, Soames' not less true and wholehearted devotion to the very best article that could be obtained for the money, had rendered him averse to believing that things worth 13 shillings could not be bought with 12. "I wish I'd never undertaken your house," said Bosinney suddenly. "You come down here worrying me out of my life. You want double the value for your money anybody else would, and now that you've got a house that for its size is not to be beaten in the county, you don't want to pay for it. If you're anxious to be off your bargain, I dare say I can find the balance above the estimates myself, but I'm damned if I do another stroke of work for you." Soames regained his composure. Knowing that Bosinney had no capital, he regarded this as a wild suggestion. He saw, too, that he would be kept indefinitely out of this house on which he had set his heart, and just at the crucial point when the architect's personal care made all the difference. In the meantime there was Irene to be thought of. She had been very queer lately. He really believed it was only because she had taken to Bosinney that she tolerated the idea of the house at all. It would not do to make an open breach with her. "You needn't get into a rage," he said. "If I'm willing to put up with it, I suppose you needn't cry out. All I meant was that when you tell me a thing is going to cost so much, I like to—well, in fact, I like to know where I am." "Look here," said Bosinney, and Soames was both annoyed and surprised by the shrewdness of his glance. "You've got my services dirt cheap. For the kind of work I've put into this house, and the amount of time I've given to it, you'd have had to pay Littlemaster or some other fool 4 times as much. What you want, in fact, is a first-rate man for a fourth-rate fee, and that's exactly what you've got." Soames saw that he really meant what he said, and angry though he was, the consequences of a row rose before him too vividly. He saw his house unfinished, his wife rebellious, himself a laughing-stock. "Let's go over it," he said sulkily, "and see how the money's gone." "Very well," assented Bosinney, "but we'll hurry up if you don't mind. I have to get back in time to take June to the theatre." Soames cast a stealthy look at him and said, "Coming to our place, I suppose, to meet her?" He was always coming to their place. There had been rain the night before, a spring rain, and the earth smelt of sap and wild grasses. The warm, soft breeze swung the leaves and the golden buds of the old oak tree, and in the sunshine the blackbirds were whistling their hearts out. It was such a spring day as breathes into a man an ineffable yearning, a painful sweetness, a longing that makes him stand motionless, looking at the leaves or grass, and fling out his arms to embrace he knows not what. The earth gave forth a fainting warmth, stealing up through the chilly garment in which winter had wrapped her. It was her long caress of invitation to draw men down to lie within her arms, to roll their bodies on her, and put their lips to her breast. On just such a day as this, Soames had got from Irene the promise he had asked her for so often. Seated on the fallen trunk of a tree, he had promised for the 20th time that if their marriage were not a success, she should be as free as if she had never married him. "Do you swear it?" she had said. A few days back she had reminded him of that oath. He had answered, "Nonsense, I couldn't have sworn any such thing." By some awkward fatality he remembered it now. What queer things men would swear for the sake of women! He would have sworn it at any time to gain her. He would swear it now, if thereby he could touch her. But nobody could touch her. She was cold-hearted. And memories crowded on him with the fresh, sweet savour of the spring wind, memories of his courtship. In the spring of the year 1881 he was visiting his old school fellow and client, George Liversedge, of Branksome, who, with the view of developing his pine woods in the neighbourhood of Bournemouth, had placed the formation of the company necessary to the scheme in Soames's hands. Mrs. Liversedge, with a sense of the fitness of things, had given a musical tea in his honour. Later, in the course of this function, which Soames, no musician, had regarded as an unmitigated bore, his eye had been caught by the face of a girl dressed in mourning, standing by herself. The lines of her tall, as yet rather thin figure showed through the wispy, clinging stuff of her black dress. Her black gloved hands were crossed in front of her, her lips slightly parted, and her large dark eyes wandered from face to face. Her hair, done low on her neck, seemed to gleam above her black collar like coils of shining metal. And as Soames stood looking at her, the sensation that most men have felt at one time or another went stealing through him. A peculiar satisfaction of the senses, a peculiar certainty, which novelists and old ladies call love at first sight. Still stealthily watching her, he at once made his way to his hostess, and stood doggedly waiting for the music to cease. "Who is that girl with yellow hair and dark eyes?" he asked. "That? Oh! Irene Heron. Her father, Professor Heron, died this year. She lives with her stepmother. She's a nice girl, a pretty girl, but no money." "Introduce me, please," said Soames. It was very little that he found to say, nor did he find her responsive to that little. But he went away with the resolution to see her again. He effected his object by chance, meeting her on the pier with her stepmother, who had the habit of walking there from 12 to 1 of a forenoon. Soames made this lady's acquaintance with alacrity, nor was it long before he perceived in her the ally he was looking for. His keen scent for the commercial side of family life soon told him that Irene cost her stepmother more than the £50 a year she brought her. It also told him that Mrs. Heron, a woman yet in the prime of life, desired to be married again. The strange ripening beauty of her stepdaughter stood in the way of this desirable consummation, and Soames, in his stealthy tenacity, laid his plans. He left Bournemouth without having given himself away, but in a month's time came back, and this time he spoke, not to the girl, but to her stepmother. He had made up his mind, he said. He would wait any time. And he had long to wait, watching Irene bloom, the lines of her young figure softening, the stronger blood deepening the gleam of her eyes, and warming her face to a creamy glow. And at each visit he proposed to her, and when that visit was at an end, took her refusal away with him back to London, sore at heart, but steadfast and silent as the grave. He tried to come at the secret springs of her resistance. Only once had he a gleam of light. It was at one of those assembly dances, which afford the only outlet to the passions of the population of seaside watering-places. He was sitting with her in an embrasure, his senses tingling with the contact of the waltz. She had looked at him over her slowly waving fan, and he had lost his head. Seizing that moving wrist, he pressed his lips to the flesh of her arm, and she had shuddered. To this day he had not forgotten that shudder, nor the look so passionately averse she had given him. A year after that she had yielded. What had made her yield he could never make out, and from Mrs. Heron, a woman of some diplomatic talent, he learnt nothing. Once after they were married he asked her, "What made you refuse me so often?" She had answered by a strange silence. An enigma to him from the day that he first saw her, she was an enigma to him still. Bosinney was waiting for him at the door, and on his rugged, good-looking face was a queer, yearning, yet happy look, as though he too saw a promise of bliss in the spring sky, sniffed a coming happiness in the spring air. Soames looked at him waiting there. What was the matter with the fellow that he looked so happy? What was he waiting for with that smile on his lips and in his eyes? Soames could not see that for which Bosinney was waiting as he stood there, drinking in the flower-scented wind. And once more he felt baffled in the presence of this man whom by habit he despised. He hastened on to the house. "The only colour for those tiles," he heard Bosinney say, "is ruby with a grey tint in the stuff, to give a transparent effect. I should like Irene's opinion. I'm ordering the purple leather curtains for the doorway of this court, and if you distemper the drawing-room ivory cream over paper, you'll get an elusive look. You want to aim all through the decorations at what I call charm." Soames said, "You mean that my wife has charm?" Bosinney evaded the question. "You should have a clump of iris plants in the centre of that court." Soames smiled superciliously. "I'll look into beeches sometime," he said, "and see what's appropriate." They found little else to say to each other, but on the way to the station Soames asked, "I suppose you find Irene very artistic?" "Yes." The abrupt answer was as distinct a snub as saying, "If you want to discuss her, you can do it with someone else." And the slow, sulky anger Soames had felt all the afternoon burned the brighter within him. Neither spoke again till they were close to the station. Then Soames asked, "When do you expect to have finished?" "By the end of June, if you really wish me to decorate as well." Soames nodded. "But you quite understand," he said, "that the house is costing me a lot beyond what I contemplated. I may as well tell you that I should have thrown it up, only I'm not in the habit of giving up what I've set my mind on." Bosinney made no reply, and Soames gave him askance a look of dogged dislike, for in spite of his fastidious air and that supercilious, dandified taciturnity, Soames, with his set lips and squared chin, was not unlike a bulldog. When, at 7 o'clock that evening, June arrived at 62 Montpellier Square, the maid Bilson told her that Mr. Bosinney was in the drawing-room. The mistress, she said, was dressing, and would be down in a minute. She would tell her that Miss June was here. June stopped her at once. "All right, Bilson," she said, "I'll just go in. You needn't hurry Mrs. Soames." She took off her cloak, and Bilson, with an understanding look, did not even open the drawing-room door for her, but ran downstairs. June paused for a moment to look at herself in the little old-fashioned silver mirror above the oaken rug chest. A slim, imperious young figure, with a small, resolute face, and a white frock, cut moon-shaped at the base of a neck too slender for her crown of twisted red gold hair. She opened the drawing-room door softly, meaning to take him by surprise. The room was filled with the sweet, hot scent of flowering azaleas. She took a long breath of the perfume, and heard Bosinney's voice, not in the room, but quite close, saying, "Ah, there were such heaps of things I wanted to talk about, and now we shan't have time." Irene's voice answered, "Why not at dinner?" "How can one talk?" June's first thought was to go away, but instead she crossed to the long window opening on the little court. It was from there that the scent of the azaleas came, and standing with their backs to her, their faces buried in the golden pink blossoms, stood her lover and Irene. Silent but unashamed, with flaming cheeks and angry eyes, the girl watched. "Come on Sunday by yourself. We can go over the house together." June saw Irene look up at him through her screen of blossoms. It was not the look of a coquette, but, far worse to the watching girl, of a woman fearful lest that look should say too much. "I've promised to go for a drive with Uncle. The big one. Make him bring you. It's only 10 miles, the very thing for his horses. Poor old Uncle Swithin." A wave of the azalea scent drifted into June's face. She felt sick and dizzy. "Do, ah, do." "But why?" "I must see you there. I thought you'd like to help me." The answer seemed to the girl to come softly with a tremble from amongst the blossoms. "So I do." And she stepped into the open space of the window. "How stuffy it is here," she said. "I can't bear this scent." Her eyes, so angry and direct, swept both their faces. "Were you talking about the house? I haven't seen it yet, you know. Shall we all go on Sunday?" From Irene's face the colour had flown. "I am going for a drive that day with Uncle Swithin," she answered. "Uncle Swithin? What does he matter? You can throw him over." "I am not in the habit of throwing people over." There was a sound of footsteps, and June saw Soames standing just behind her. "Well, if you are all ready," said Irene, looking from one to the other with a strange smile, "dinner is too." End of Part 2, Chapter 1. Recording by Leanne Howlett.
Part 2, Chapter 2. The Man of Property. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Eva Harnick. The Forsyte Saga. The Man of Property by John Galsworthy. Part number 2, Chapter number 2. June Street. In silence the soup was finished, excellent if a little thick, and fish was brought. In silence it was handed. Bosinney ventured, "It is the first spring day." Irene echoed softly, "Yes, the first spring day." "Spring," said June. "There isn't a breath of air." No one replied. The fish was taken away, a fine fresh sole from Dover, and Bilson brought champagne, a bottle swathed around the neck with white. Soames said, "You'll find it dry." Cutlets were handed, each pink frilled about the legs. They were refused by June, and silence fell. Soames said, "You had better take a cutlet, June. There is nothing coming." But June again refused, so they were borne away. And then Irene asked, "Phil, have you heard my blackbird?" Bosinney answered, "Rather. He's got a hunting song. As I came round I heard him in the square. He's such a darling." "Salad, sir?" Spring chicken was removed. But Soames was speaking. "The asparagus is very poor. Bosinney, glass of sherry with your sweet. June, you are drinking nothing." June said, "You know I never do. Wine is such horrid stuff." An apple charlotte came upon a silver dish, and smilingly Irene said, "The azaleas are so wonderful this year." To this Bosinney murmured, "Wonderful. The scent is extraordinary." June said, "How can you like the scent? Sugar, please, Bilson." Sugar was handed her, and Soames remarked, "This charlotte is good." The charlotte was removed. Long silence followed. Irene, beckoning, said, "Take out the azalea, Bilson. Miss June can't bear the scent." "No, let it stay," said June. Olives from France with Russian caviar were placed on little plates, and Soames remarked, "Why can't we have the Spanish?" But no one answered. The olives were removed. Lifting her tumbler, June demanded, "Give me some water, please." Water was given her. A silver tray was brought with German plums. There was a lengthy pause. In perfect harmony all were eating them. Bosinney counted up the stones. "This year, next year, sometime." Irene finished softly, "Never." There was such a glorious sunset. The sky is all ruby still, so beautiful. He answered, "Underneath the dark." Their eyes had met, and June cried scornfully, "A London sunset." Egyptian cigarettes were handed in a silver box. Soames, taking one, remarked, "What time does your play begin?" No one replied, and Turkish coffee followed in enamelled cups. Irene, smiling quietly, said, "If only—" "Only what?" said June. "If only it could always be the spring." Brandy was handed. It was pale and old. Soames said, "Bosinney, better take some brandy." Bosinney took a glass. They all arose. "You want a cab?" asked Soames. June answered, "No, my cloak, please, Bilson." Her cloak was brought. Irene from the window murmured, "Such a lovely night. The stars are coming out." Soames added, "Well, I hope you will both enjoy yourselves." From the door June answered, "Thanks. Come, Phil." Bosinney cried, "I'm coming." Soames smiled a sneering smile and said, "I wish you luck." And at the door Irene watched them go. Bosinney called, "Good night." "Good night," she answered softly. June made her lover take her on the top of a bus, saying she wanted air, and there sat silent with her face to the breeze. The driver turned once or twice with the intention of venturing a remark, but thought better of it. They were a lively couple. The spring had got into his blood, too. He felt the need for letting steam escape, and clucked his tongue, flourishing his whip, wheeling his horses, and even they, poor things, had smelt the spring, and for a brief half-hour spurned the pavement with happy hoofs. The whole town was alive. The boughs, curled upward with their decking of young leaves, awaited some gift the breeze could bring. New-lit lamps were gaining mastery, and the faces of the crowd showed pale under that glare, while on high the great white clouds slid swiftly, softly over the purple sky. Men in evening dress had thrown back overcoats, stepping jauntily up the steps of clubs. Working folk loitered, and women, those women who at that time of night are solitary and moving eastward in a stream, swung slowly along with expectation in their gait, dreaming of good wine and a good supper, or, for an unwonted minute, of kisses given for love. Those countless figures going their ways under the lamps and the moving sky had one and all received some restless blessing from the stir of spring. And one and all, like those clubmen with their opened coats, had shed something of caste and creed and custom, and by the cock of their hats, the pace of their walk, their laughter, or their silence, revealed their common kinship under the passionate heavens. Bosinney and June entered the theatre in silence, and mounted to their seats in the upper boxes. The piece had just begun, and the half-darkened house, with its rows of creatures peering all one way, resembled a great garden of flowers turning their faces to the sun. June had never before been in the upper boxes. From the age of 15 she had habitually accompanied her grandfather to the stalls, and not common stalls, but the best seats in the house, towards the centre of the third row, booked by Old Jolyon at Grogan and Boyne's, on his way home from the city long before the day, carried in his overcoat pocket, together with his cigar case and his old kid gloves, and handed to June to keep till the appointed night. And in those stalls an erect old figure with a serene white head, a little figure strenuous and eager with a red gold head, they would sit through every kind of play, and on the way home Old Jolyon would say of the principal actor, "Oh, he's a poor stick. You should have seen little Bobson." She had looked forward to this evening with keen delight. It was stolen, chaperoneless, undreamed of at Stanhope Gate, where she was supposed to be at Soames's. She had expected reward for her subterfuge, planned for her lover's sake. She had expected it to break up the thick, chilly cloud and make the relations between them, which of late had been so puzzling, so tormenting, sunny and simple again, as they had been before the winter. She had come with the intention of saying something definite, and she looked at the stage with a furrow between her brows, seeing nothing, her hands squeezed together in her lap. A swarm of jealous suspicions stung and stung her. If Bosinney was conscious of her trouble, he made no sign. The curtain dropped. The first act had come to an end. "It is awfully hot here," said the girl. "I should like to go out." She was very white, and she knew, for with her nerves thus sharpened she saw everything, that he was both uneasy and compunctious. At the back of the theatre an open balcony hung over the street. She took possession of this and stood leaning there without a word, waiting for him to begin. At last she could bear it no longer. "I want to say something to you, Phil," she said. "Yes?" The defensive tone of his voice brought the color flying to her cheek, the words flying to her lips. "You don't give me a chance to be nice to you. You haven't for ages now." Bosinney stared down at the street. He made no answer. June cried passionately, "You know I want to do everything for you, that I want to be everything to you." A hum rose from the street, and piercing it with a sharp ping, the bell sounded for the raising of the curtain. June did not stir. A desperate struggle was going on within her. Should she put everything to the proof? Should she challenge directly that influence, that attraction, which was driving him away from her? It was her nature to challenge, and she said, "Phil, take me to see the house on Sunday." With a smile quivering and breaking on her lips, and trying, how hard, not to show that she was watching, she searched his face, saw it waver and hesitate, saw a troubled line come between his brows, the blood rush into his face. He answered, "Not Sunday, dear, some other day." "Why not Sunday? I shouldn't be in the way on Sunday." He made an evident effort and said, "I have an engagement." "You are going to take—" His eyes grew angry. He shrugged his shoulders and answered, "An engagement that will prevent my taking you to see the house." June bit her lip till the blood came, and walked back to her seat without another word, but she could not help the tears of rage rolling down her face. The house had been mercifully darkened for a crisis, and no one could see her trouble. Yet in this world of Forsytes, let no man think himself immune from observation. In the third row behind, Euphemia, Nicholas's youngest daughter, with her married sister, Mrs. Tweetyman, were watching. They reported at Timothy's how they had seen June and her fiancé at the theatre. In the stalls? No, not in the... Oh, in the dress circle, of course. That seemed to be quite fashionable nowadays with young people. Well, not exactly. In the... Anyway, that engagement wouldn't last long. They had never seen anyone look so thunder and lightningy as that little June. With tears of enjoyment in their eyes, they related how she had kicked a man's hat as she returned to her seat in the middle of an act, and how the man had looked. Euphemia had a noted, silent laugh, terminating most disappointingly in squeaks. And when Mrs. Small, holding up her hands, said, "My dear, kicked a hat?" she let out such a number of these that she had to be recovered with smelling salts. As she went away, she said to Mrs. Tweetyman, "Kicked the hat? Oh, I shall die." For that little June, this evening that was to have been her treat was the most miserable she had ever spent. God knows, she tried to stifle her pride, her suspicion, her jealousy. She parted from Bosinney at Old Jolyon's door without breaking down. The feeling that her lover must be conquered was strong enough to sustain her till his retiring footsteps brought home the true extent of her wretchedness. The noiseless Sankey let her in. She would have slipped up to her own room, but Old Jolyon, who had heard her entrance, was in the dining-room doorway. "Come in and have your milk," he said. "It has been kept hot for you. You are very late. Where have you been?" June stood at the fireplace, with a foot on the fender and an arm on the mantelpiece, as her grandfather had done when he came in that night of the opera. She was too near a breakdown to care what she told him. "We dined at Soames's." The man of property. His wife there, and Bosinney? Yes. Old Jolyon's glance was fixed on her with the penetrating gaze from which it was difficult to hide. But she was not looking at him, and when she turned her face, he dropped his scrutiny at once. He had seen enough, and too much. He bent down to lift a cup of milk for her from the hearth, and turning away, grumbled, "You ought not to stay out so late. It makes you fit for nothing." He was invisible now behind his paper, which he turned with a vicious crackle, but when June came up to kiss him, he said, "Good night, my darling," in a tone so tremulous and unexpected that it was all the girl could do to get out of the room without breaking into the fit of sobbing which lasted her well on into the night. When the door was closed, Old Jolyon dropped his paper and stared long and anxiously in front of him. "The beggar," he thought. "I always knew she would have trouble with him." Uneasy doubts and suspicions, the more poignant that he felt himself powerless to check or control the march of events, came crowding upon him. Was the fellow going to jilt her? He longed to go and say to him, "Look here, you sir, are you going to jilt my granddaughter?" But how could he? Knowing little or nothing, he was yet certain, with his unerring astuteness, that there was something going on. He suspected Bosinney of being too much at Montpellier Square. "This fellow," he thought, "may not be a scamp. His face is not a bad one, but he is a queer fish. I don't know what to make of him. I shall never know what to make of him. They tell me he works like a nigger, but I see no good coming of it. He is unpractical, he has no method. When he comes here, he sits as glum as a monkey. If I ask him what wine he will have, he says, 'Thanks, any wine.' If I offer him a cigar, he smokes it as if it were a twopenny German thing. I never see him looking at June as he ought to look at her, and yet he is not after her money. If she were to make a sign, He would be off his bargain tomorrow. But she won't, not she. She will stick to him. She's as obstinate as fate. She will never let go. Sighing deeply, he turned the paper in its columns. Perchance he might find consolation. And upstairs in her room, June sat at her open window, where the spring wind came after its revel across the park, to cool her hot cheeks and burn her heart. End of Part 2, Chapter 2. June's Treat. Reading by Eva Harnick.